Good afternoon and welcome to Burn News and Views. I'm your host, Don Burgess, and with us today we're going to be talking about living wage in Bermuda, and we have three esteemed members of and this may not be exact correct title, but the Wage Commission. And we have the chair, Cordell Riley. Welcome.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thanks for having us.
Martha Dismont.
Hello, nice to see you.
And Craig Simmons.
Thanks, Don, for having us on.
Okay. Now, I said Wage Commission, but I mean, it's been under, I guess, the guise of a couple different names over the years. But the work started back in 2015. And why has it taken it so long to bring this much needed relief to Bermuda's low income workers?
Well, I think that's more of an answer for those in the political spectrum. Why that has taken so long. We were appointed in January of 2020, and our remit was to, in the first year, bring recommendations for a minimum wage, and then in the following year, bring a recommendation for a livable wage. So we have kept on track. So the reason why it took from 2015 to 2020 is really out of our remit.
Okay. I guess part of the thing too is so when the work started originally back in 2015, it was focused on a living wage. Craig, can you explain to us the difference between a living wage and a minimum wage? What we're talking about here?
Sure. Well, minimum wage is, as it suggests, it's a floor below which wages shouldn't go. So let's just say, for sake of argument, the minimum wage was set at $15. That would suggest that an employer could not offer an employee anything less than $15 per hour. A livable wage is more aspirational. It's something that we would like employers to offer their employees so that they could live a good life, as it were, or at least reach some basic level of comfort and well-being for themselves and for their families. So I think that's the basic difference. One is a sort of mandated minimum, and the other is something for which I think the government is aspiring toward. And we see that happening, in fact, in the United Kingdom. They've hired a University of Massachusetts economist, Dubé, and he's, the report just came out in, November, October of 2019. And so the British government is going essentially through what we're going through right now. They're setting a minimum wage and along with that, the concept of a livable wage, one that would be, as I said, aspirational for the people of the United Kingdom.
Now, Cordell, you just mentioned like you've made recommendations for a minimum wage. And then next year you're going to make one for a livable wage. So what are some of the recommendations for the minimum wage at this point?
So in our report, we came out with three recommendations based on how government wants to move forward. So as Craig just mentioned, there is the wage floor. And so we basically took the recommendation of the Joint Select Committee, which was $12.25. And we just adjusted that for inflation. So that's how we came up with the $13.20. Then we took it at 50% of the median hourly wage, because there was discussion surrounding the fact that if we are doing it for the first time, do we want to recommend a wage that was below the poverty line? And so the poverty line is universally known as the medium, half of the medium hourly wage. So do you want to have something that was below that? And so the 50% of the median wage came out at about $15.75, so that if the government went for there, it would not be below the poverty line. And then the last one at $17.30, we looked at the fact that at some point we are going to be bringing a living wage into being. And a living wage tends to be much higher because you look at what it costs to live, as Craig just mentioned. So we were looking at the cost of living. We were looking at the consumer price index and creating sort of a basket of goods, and from that determining a livable wage, and that's going to be higher. And so in our research, it was determined that if you were going to bring on a living wage regime, then you may not want to go too low, because then you've got to close that gap. And so that's how we came up with the 3 tiers.
Right. Now, I think within your report that it mentioned the number of people who are living below the poverty line in Bermuda.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was that number, and how will this sort of redress the race to the bottom that the report mentions by bringing in low-income workers to keep wages low?
Well, we estimated there were between about 4,500 and just under 5,000 that could be at that below the minimum. And so because the data is in brackets, so looking at that, we were able to estimate that amount, which is about 15% of the workforce. It could be less than that, for some people, because we didn't include tips, we didn't include gratuities, but so it could be less than that. And how it will obviously impact them. And so if they're, say for instance, they're earning $10 now, and we came in at the minimum of 13, then of course it's obviously going to be a great impact for them, because that gives them $3 more an hour. So it's going to have for them a very positive impact. And of course, as you know, and this is where Craig can chime in, that money is probably going to recirculate in the economy rather than it going into some savings account or anything like that.
Craig, did you want to add to that?
Well, I suppose I can add that it's important for the public to sort of get a sense of the work that we've done. And so I would recommend that people take a look at some of the reports and studies that have been written over the last, say, 20 years. Perhaps the sort of easiest way to get in to sort of get a handle on the research that's been done is in the form of a podcast. So I would highly recommend that people take a listen to one of my favorite podcasts. It's called Freakonomics, Freakonomics.com. And if you put in the keyword minimum wage, up will come what I would consider one of the best summaries on the minimum wage that I've heard. It came out in April of this year. The episode number is 460, and they do a very good job of presenting a balanced view on the minimum wage. And so I would strongly recommend that the public acquaint themselves with the literature, starting with the Freakonomics podcast. And if you like, take a look at what the British government is going through, which they produced something in 2019. I think the executive summary in that report, the author is Dubey, D-U-B-E. His first name, which I can't pronounce, he's of Indian extraction. Aaron, A-R-I-N-D, Dubey. He's from the University of Amherst, and the United Kingdom government have retained him to give them a sort of a sense of sort of how the minimum wage has fared internationally. Another very good study was also done by Dubey, looking at the fast food restaurant industry in the United States. Economists trying to be somewhat scientific in their analysis, and I think that's important. Another very important study would be, to use a technical term, the channels through which, once the minimum wage is implemented, how that will sort of make its way through the economy. Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting findings of that particular study was that, well, employment didn't change very much. Number of hours didn't change very much, but what did change almost instantly were prices in the affected sectors. And so, I think these kinds of reports can give the public an informed view of the minimum wage debate. And I think it's important for people, my grandmother and my aunties and so on, to have their views heard, and for people like me to sort of listen to those views, because one of my greatest fears is that sort of the technicians like myself and Cordell will drown out the other voices. And so I am really interested in listening to the views of my dear colleague, Martha Dismont, for whom I have so much respect and for whom I rely on for sort of that grandmotherly, that auntie perspective. So please, Martha, enlighten us.
I'm not sure what the question is that you would like for me to enlighten you upon, but I certainly appreciate the sentiment that is asking what's the other side of this coin with regard to why, whether it's the minimum wage or getting to the livable wage. And as I was listening to you two wonderful technicians speak, I was thinking quite a bit about the fact that there are a number within our population who will be celebrating that they will receive potentially, if this goes into law, at whichever level it goes into, they will receive potentially an increased wage and be able to afford their expenses. I know of numerous people in my former job who would come to us because they simply could not pay their rent, much less their groceries, electricity bill, etc. I know of many people who chose to remove electricity from their home because they could not afford to pay the electricity bill, the grocery, and the rent, etc. Therefore, to some degree, what we're looking for is the dignity for individuals to be able to afford simple, basic living, and then to find ways to help those employers who must pay more than $10 an hour in this economy to be able to afford that without increasing those prices. But if we're looking for dignity and a way in which individuals can simply live in their own country without having arrears of rent and et cetera, and becoming homeless, as I've seen that as well, then we have to find a way to ensure that we can increase wages. And as Cordell knows very well, I'm a strong proponent of supporting employers to be able to manage that without then having them suffer the consequences of increased wage. It has to be the proper balanced approach.
Now, in the report, it talks about dignity at work. Is this sort of idea that you're talking about?
Dignity at work?
Mhm.
Absolutely. Across the board. I mean, as Cordell mentioned, we saw as a start approximately 5,000 employees that were receiving below $10 or below per hour in their work environment. And you can imagine that these employees are simply grateful to be working, but it is not sustainable. And therefore, you can imagine the jobs that they're in where they are only receiving $10 an hour or less, and how they must feel about that, particularly going home at the end of the week without the proper wage to take care of themselves or their family. It is an issue, and we should, as a country, be concerned about it and find a way together to address it so that everybody has the proper sense of dignity.
Now, if government does approve the 1575 as the starting point, that means they're getting a 50% pay increase to help them right off the bat.
Well, at the end of the day, if that's what they need, I mean, the amounts that the Wage Commission are recommending were there was a lot of work that has gone into considering what that minimum wage should be. And as Cordell has so rightfully said, attempting to go below 15 would still put some at the poverty level. We have a high cost of living, and if we did not, it would be a different issue here, I think. But Bermuda has a high cost of living and therefore is requiring individuals to have substantially more than in some other countries. Again, in order to achieve dignity, you must give people a wage where if they can't get beyond that because of lack of skills or whatever it is, then at least allow them to live sensibly in their own home.
Yeah. You mentioned $10 an hour or less. What's the lowest amount that the Wage Commission came across somebody who was earning?
Cordell, did you see those figures?
No, I did request information with regards to the employment that the individuals who are unemployed now and receiving government finance. I did receive some figures there, but I wasn't able to quite determine what the lowest wage was. We kind of sort of got information through our committee and those who in the industry that it could be, they were mentioning there are some who might be earning around $7.50 an hour. So we know that there are wages that are less than $10 an hour, and these are the people who might be doing the second job, so they're getting by, but they're having to work twice as hard. So they're living, but it's quite hard. Now, one of the things that Craig did mention was how it goes through the economy. One of the studies I've seen indicated that for every 10% increase in the living wage, because most countries have a living wage, for every 10% increase, there is a 1/3% increase in the cost of living. So if, for instance, it went up by 50, for those who are earning $10 an hour and their wage now is at $15 an hour, that could, if my math is correct, that's about 1.7% increase in the cost of living. With the rate of inflation now, Craig can help me out here, around about just under 1%. It's a half the increase, but it's still minimal in terms of the impact on the economy. And the other question that we're often asked is, well, who's going to pay for it? Well, people generally pay, or companies generally pay for their workers through the sale of goods and services. And so, as Craig mentioned just a moment ago, that you tend to see it directly increase in the sectors affected. One study suggested that for every the increase in the minimum wage was paid for by the consumer through increase in prices. By 75% of it was paid by the consumer. Actually, the employer actually paid 25%. So if it went from $10 to 25% of that, $2 and change, I would imagine. So that's what the employer would end up paying. But they could. This is just studies done to show what has happened. Of course, they can put the prices up to cover the full cost. But I should point out also that the cost of labor is only one part of the cost of the goods sold. So that means that you shouldn't have an employer saying, well, my prices went up by $3 because my labor went up by $3. Labor is only a part of the cost. So your labor cost is going up by $3, but your overall cost may have remained the same, so that the increase to the customer may be $1 instead of a $3 cost. So they wouldn't be able to say truthfully that blame the wage commission because they're the ones who recommended this, because it's only part of the overall cost of a good or service being sold.
Yeah. And I guess the other factor too is depends how close each business is paying to whatever ends up being the recommended amount. I mean, if you're already paying at the level or above, the effect on the business are not going to be too much. But if business is way below, then you might see a big spike in prices.
Right.
Yeah, there's also the issue of fairness, which is something that economists aren't particularly keen on talking about. Social psychologists who seem to have a better handle on the economy than economists do understand well that fairness is in fact a constraint on the ability of a company to make profits. We know from game theory that people who play these games, like the ultimatum game, that if I feel like the person on the other side of the game has done something unfair to me, I am willing, because of vengeance, I am willing to suffer significantly to try and get them back. So this idea that, well, business people are, that's their job to make as much money as possible, and this sort of approach that was, I think, first enunciated by Milton Friedman way back in the 1970s, that firms shouldn't think about any social issues. Well, I think that view has now been dismissed because we understand that an economy operates inside the society. Put another way, the economy doesn't equal society. The economy exists within. And so our economy tends to be based on a system of markets. We like that idea, demand and supply. But to take that system of markets beyond where it's supposed to go and apply it to all manner of relationships is a bridge too far. And so you tend to put yourself in a position to dismiss issues of fairness. And social psychologists have shown very clearly that when a consumer or an employer feels that they're treated unfairly, efficiency suffers, productivity suffers. And so with this minimum wage, with a livable wage, it's really about injecting fairness and to a large extent, greater productivity. We've sort of seen that happen in Bermuda in the 1980s, I think it would be, when the exempt companies, the excess liability companies came to Bermuda, Ace and Excel in 86 and 87. They offered Bermudians what economists like to call an efficiency wage. So they came in and they saw how much people were being paid, and they went well above it. Henry Ford, the industrialist of the early 20th century, employed a similar tactic when he wanted to run his assembly lines. He paid well above the market wage, and he said it was the best investment he ever made. Similarly, in the 80s with Ace and Excel, they were able to attract the highest quality workers. And of course, those businesses are now multinational corporations operating, making profits in the billions of dollars every 3 months, given that they started at ground zero. My point is this, is that when people have a sense of fairness in the sort of economic domain, they will work like slaves. But if you treat them like they're a slave, your productivity is not going to work, which is probably the main reason why there was an Emancipation Proclamation back in August 1st of 1834, because people realized you need to have a carrot. There needs to be dignity. There needs to be fairness. These sort of wishy-washy things that economists don't like talking about are very, very important to overall productivity.
People want to be able to work and earn a living, what they think is a fair wage. They're not willing to work. We see in Bermuda, there are certain businesses that always seem to be hiring people from other countries that a Bermudian can do the job, but they're just not willing to work for that amount of money.
Yes. And then I go into that business and I'm looking around for a Bermudian, someone that sounds and looks like me, and I can't find them. And I feel sort of, well, wait a minute. Do I really want to be patronizing these kinds of businesses?
And you also want to, when you talk about fairness, Craig, it's a really good point, because when you have, businesses have to decide for now, certainly on an interim basis, whether they're willing to take less profit. We get it that particularly retail businesses have suffered over the past couple of years and may not be not only not making a profit, but not really finding themselves in any kind of net income basis at the end of the year. However, that's a bit about the COVID, et cetera, that we've gone through. But at some point, you're going to have to consider whether you would be willing to make less profit in the interest of dignity for individuals. And at the same time, remember that when individuals have a little bit more money in their pockets and actually can pay their rent on time, their landlord will not go 2 months without their income or their rent. And so it goes back around. We need to get more money in the pockets of Bermudians so that they can actually go to the restaurant or spend their money in the community, but we have to start somewhere where they feel like they can live a normal life. And it may have to start with businesses taking less profit, which I'm sure they're not happy to hear about that. But I'm praying that that's on an interim basis while we figure out how to balance this out.
What effect has the pandemic had on Bermuda's need for a living wage or minimum wage?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
What effect has the pandemic had on the Bermuda's need for a minimum wage?
Well, yes, of course. When we started out, the pandemic was something. Well, was an epidemic over there in China. It wasn't anywhere else, as far as we knew. But what we found, and I think we've mentioned that in the report, was that there has been this view, and this was espoused by the Economist magazine, that the one thing that Western governments should have learned is the need to top up the wages of the lower earning individuals. And I've since seen reports that Bloomberg have said the same thing, and the Brookings Institution has also have found the same thing. So if anything, it's been more positive because we've seen how these workers, which we call essential workers, have been out there on the front lines. Your gas attendants, your people who stack the shelves at the grocery stores, who out there taking great risk while like persons like myself can then sit at home and work and benefit by not having to go out there, have our food delivered. But these are the workers who are earning lower wages, but we've deemed them as essential workers. So I think it has impacted in terms of the need to really look at those wages and make sure that they are topped up some, because those individuals, particularly the ones in the hospitality industry who have not been able to have work, they have used up all their savings, so they would have had minimal savings. They work in an industry which has at best an 8-month season. And so, it's a real need. If you go back to this whole dignity piece, it's a real need to be able to give them something during the time when they are earning, so that during the slow periods or when we have something of this nature, that they have something to fall back on. Because what's happened is the government has kicked in and sort of helped them out. So we have to really look at this whole thing collectively. And we do know, because it came up a lot in our discussions, that this is not something, and I think the minister mentioned this at the press conference, that it's not something to be borne by the employer alone. It is something that as government is going to look at in terms of how do we lower the cost of living. One of the critical things is that you have to have health insurance. When people lose their jobs, out goes their health insurance. And so the government had already looked at a national health insurance plan. The other thing I want to say before I turn it over to my colleagues is that people tend to think an increase in prices is a negative. There are people who are willing to pay more, particularly at restaurants, et cetera, knowing that that extra money pays somebody a decent wage. And so it's not necessarily a negative if prices increase, because people feel they would know that these people are not being exploited.
You mentioned restaurants. And how is the people who earn gratuities, how is that going to be figured differently, or is it going to be figured the same as far as the minimum wage goes?
Well, we had a lot of discussion around that, and of course, one of our members is in the restaurant sector, so obviously we deferred a lot of that conversation to him. At the end of the day, we sort of kind of determined that gratuities will be part of it. I know in the UK that's not the case. There are several models that have a hybrid method. But and we're going to use that hybrid method. So gratuities are going to factor it in, because I think the bottom line that we came to, that if we say that the minimum wage is $15, should we be ultimately concerned as to how it is arrived at? whether it's through direct payment or whether it's through gratuities. And if the answer to that question is no, then if you factor in gratuities, then that's where we got the feedback that if it was at the lower end, most of those in that sector will be able to reach the minimum wage.
Right. So are gratuities being factored in as part of the 15, and the employer is responsible for raising it to 15 if it's 15.75, because government hasn't set what it is. But let's say it's 15.75, and the with gratuities, the employee is only making $15 an hour, then the employer will be responsible for topping up to their 75 cents an hour.
That's correct.
Okay. I guess the different sectors are treated differently a little as well. You talked about in the report people who are under the age of 18, or people who are doing training programs or apprenticeship programs. Why were these treated differently?
Well, I think I mean, there are a number of in the ILO reports that we used that sort of have carve-outs for these individuals. And we kind of looked at that and saw which ones applied. And of course, there are some that would have been unique to Bermuda that we used. For instance, the grocery packers, we had considerable discussion around that particular category, and we decided that they would be exempt, those over 18. So yeah, largely, if you were to look at what the ILO, the International Labor Organization, recommends, it's pretty much what we've had in our report.
Now, the other thing was the report talked about possible inequality with people who are getting gratuities, not getting taxed on that on it compared to somebody else who's making the proposed 15.75. How will that be addressed?
You want to take that one, Craig?
Well, that is a tough one, because we all know that gratuities aren't subject to taxation. And if you do the arithmetic, it's quite possible that someone who's sort of operating below the minimum wage in the hospitality sector could in fact make more than someone who's, say, in construction, because of the fact that those gratuities aren't subject to payroll tax. And so that's sort of one of the elephants that are in the room. And it's one of the sort of idiosyncrasies of life in Bermuda, and that's why we have the carve-outs. It's never going to be a perfect system, and but it's one I think that we can live with, because we're attempting to sort of achieve a modest goal, and that is, as Martha has eloquently said, to bring a sense of dignity to those folks at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And what we've seen in the last 12 months with COVID and Black Lives Matter, I think, is a shift in social norms. And it also has exposed, as Cordell has suggested, some gaps in the market mechanism, because COVID has made it very clear that people that work in healthcare, especially those at the bottom of the payroll, their contribution to our society is not in any way, shape, or form reflected in their pay. One would have thought that if the market was working efficiently, that magically those people, those healthcare workers who are making, $15 an hour, magically their wage would go to $1,000 an hour, because quite frankly, they are the warriors. They're the people keeping us on this screen safe, but their wages didn't change. So that tells me that there's something woefully inadequate about the market. But what we have seen is a shift in the social norm, a shift toward an understanding that equality is important, that fairness is important, and that people like me are willing to pay a bit extra to see our brethren and sistren, live a good life. the life that we would expect for our children and our grandchildren. And so in many ways, Black Lives Matter and the presence of COVID, I think, is moving us in the right direction. It was sorely needed, I think, because that sort of old way of thinking the market is always right, was sort of gripping us and not allowing us to think sensibly about how we're going to sort of conduct ourselves in Bermuda or indeed globally. The idea that 64 people on the planet control half of the wealth of the planet. I mean, when you think about that, 64 people owning half the wealth on the planet, that just, I don't know how people can sort of accept that's okay. When at the same time, you've got millions, hundreds of millions of people living in abject poverty, and we want to claim to be a civilized society. But you can't have it both ways.
Right.
And I think the other thing to consider is that a proper wage is part of the equation. It isn't the be all end all. There's no doubt about it. Those who are struggling to take care of themselves and their family, there are other issues involved. There may be a skills problem. There may be the lack of education. There may be trauma in the family, and therefore this initiative, I have to give credit where credit is due, and Ralph Commission bringing it forward, is to simply deal with one part of the equation, that if individuals had at least a decent wage, then maybe they can go and get the education they need, can go and workforce development and other organizations should be helping to bring the skills up for individuals who need to be in the workforce making a decent wage. And then we have to address the trauma that people have had over the years that have caused them to be in that poverty environment. It isn't just about your income. It's a number of things, and that's why this is really about the entire community. It particularly is about where government weighs in to support, whether it's employers or employees. I give them a lot of credit for what they did in 2020, particularly during the pandemic, and to ensure that no one was completely lost because their job was not up and running. We have to look at that as a society. And I'm looking for our society to be a bit more socially conscious, that, as Craig and I were talking about earlier, this is not about us all living in our silos and hoping we make it. We will be. I believe that the community is as strong as its weakest link. And if our weaker link is not being supported, the community is not going to be successful nor survive. And therefore, if we can take this as a community issue and begin to build up and strengthen all of these different pillars, from income for individuals to the education and the skills, and address some of this mental, emotional trauma, then we will see individuals that will, live more normally. So I just wanted to say that I just think it's more than this, and we are happy. I'm certainly happy to be in this space to help this particular part of the equation.
Well, I know, like, government's talked about also addressing the healthcare issue, which has sort of been delayed by the pandemic now, and as well as cost of living in general.
Absolutely.
So it's all part of a interconnected web to help uplift everyone
and have the proper quality of life, which you hear about this beautiful island of Bermuda attracting people to come here. And part of your population don't see that because of the circumstance they're in. So this is just a small effort. Hopefully will become a decent effort to at least give them the quality of life that they deserve as residents.
Yeah. Now, this question might be more for our friends on Parliament Hill, but any feelings on how much the fine should be for employers who try to skirt the minimum wage law?
No, we haven't really looked at that. I mean, we can probably take a look at what other jurisdictions have done. We just know that based on some of the ILO members of things that have happened, there has been collusion, and so we sort of thought we'd put that in there. But as we go into phase 2, we can probably have a look at some of the legislation. But I don't know what those fines would be.
And then the last question, before I give you all a chance to say a last word, when will this hopefully go into effect?
Well, again, that's another political question because our mandate was to in the first year to bring a recommendations for a minimum wage, and so I was surprised when the minister indicated that he's going to wait now until we bring forward the other report. It makes sense, of course, to look at them both together. And so I was thinking that the minimum wage will be sort of passed this year. And then, of course, following year, the living wage. But that gives us a little bit more time and gives us an opportunity to focus. So given that we have committed to bring the other report by the 31st of March of next year, depending how long government takes to review it, they could move as quickly as in the November schedule of bills.
Okay, so late 2022, early 2023 then.
I would imagine that's likely to be around the timetable because part of it is now, particularly with the living wage, is to get that feedback from the community, and we'll have that going into the report as well. And so I'm sure government will look at that very carefully before making up its mind as to how to go forward. But certainly, it's on record. It's saying that a minimum wage will be coming and a living wage will be coming.
Give you all a chance to say a last word, and we'll start with Craig.
Well, I'm going to finish off where I started by encouraging the public to familiarize themselves with the story of the minimum wage. I recommended the Freakonomics podcast. That's Freakonomics podcast. It came out in April of this year, episode 640. I don't know that I can encourage people more because rather than relying on sort of questionable sources, I think this is an excellent opportunity for the average Bermudian to get some sort of top-notch information about what a minimum wage can achieve, what it won't achieve, some of the downsides of the minimum wage. And as the podcast suggests, that there's a much bigger problem coming down the pipeline. It's this thing called automation, which of course is a topic for another day. But I thank you for the invitation, Dawn.
Yeah. Thank you. Martha, your chance.
Well, I want to follow the great Craig Simmons to say that I think it's so important that the average Bermudian really does their homework and take a look at really what's behind this. I want to give congratulations to Mr. Riley for the work he put into a lot of the research of this to give us, good data to consider what the recommendation should be. And then I just want to, I think it's just so important for us to just be much more socially conscious. We're a small community, and it's got to be very difficult to be doing well or being successful, and then standing right next to you is somebody who is struggling mightily. And I think the message from the pandemic is that we've got to be aware of all those around us and do what we can to help each other.
And the chairman, Mr. Cordell Riley, you get the last of the last words today.
Thank you. And I certainly begin by saying I do thank my team for being with me for this year and a half. And we're going into our second year. We've been appointed for a 3-year term. And so the last year will probably be with monitoring once government comes in with the legislation. I just wanted to touch upon two things. I did see a couple of questions flash up on the screen. One about the fact that gratuities do not all go to the actual server. I'm very aware of that. In fact, I know that in the United Kingdom, there's legislation that is actually banning the sharing of those gratuities among non-servers. There are things like management taking a cut out of it and all of that. So part of it, if that's happening here, I don't know the extent to which that sort of takes place here, but certainly that would immediately return funds back to the persons who earned it. And I think there's also something about the debt being one of the biggest challenges that we face. That is correct, but pandemic has actually added to that. in the sense that, we've had to pay for things that we didn't necessarily had budgeted for. And so that causes a challenge, but I don't think that what we're doing here doesn't impact on that in a major way. So the debt is something that's a challenge, and I think that's something that the government has to look at as well. But what we're doing, I don't think impacts that in any major way.
All right. I appreciate all three of you being on here today and to help elucidate the rest of the Bermuda public on what progress has been made and hopefully what they have to look forward to in a little over a year's time, especially those who are at the lower end of the income scale, and they can have a better quality of life. So on behalf, you're welcome. So on behalf of Bird News, just wish you all a very beautiful afternoon.